Really excited to share with you some of my thoughts on process-based acceptance and commitment therapy. The title of my talk is Nurturing Roots to Reach New Heights. And for me, I imagine those roots as our theoretical and our philosophical foundations, and those heights that we're reaching for as being sort of the therapist that we want to be, the heights that we want to reach with our clients in session. Revisiting Foundations of ACT, Behavior Analysis for Mastering Flexible, Process-Based Implementation. I want to be clear before we dig in too quickly, just about the perspective with which I'm speaking, or from which I'm speaking. Just like all of us, I've got my own sort of unique learning history, my own experiences, my own connections, my own classes I've taught or workshops I've taken. And so while these ideas, I'm presenting them as fitting within particular philosophical or theoretical perspectives, I want to be clear that this is my one vision of how those perspectives can be applied. So it's my perspective embedded in those perspectives. And of course, I want to acknowledge that each of you come to this presentation with your own histories, your own experience with ACT, with those theoretical foundations, those philosophical foundations. And so my hope in all this is to convey to you my perspective in a way that converges or fits with your perspective. I don't speak for anyone else, and I don't expect you to hear with anyone else's ears. Instead, by the end of the presentation, what I hope you'll leave with is sort of like a compass, a way that you could check in with this perspective and ask yourself if you're doing a piece of work that's consistent with this. It'll be something that you can bring in an ongoing way to the work that you're already doing to check and see how consistent you're being with theoretical or philosophical foundations. I want to start, one of the kind of buzzwords in the title was process-based therapy. And if you've been around for a little while, you may have noticed that process has become big in psychotherapy and counseling. The idea that instead of creating whole packages of therapy that are modularized in steps and walk people through how it is that the therapy will go, instead, emphasizing process, emphasizing the way that change should happen to account for improvements in people's lives. So process-based therapies are big right now. They're popular. There's a lot of emphasis on establishing empirically supported processes. And of course, we are somewhat ahead in acceptance and commitment therapy in this domain. If you recognize this six-sided figure, it may bring to mind what we sometimes call the hexaflex, or the six psychological flexibility model with six processes, each contributing to psychological flexibility. And we call these aspects of the model, these six pieces, we call them processes, right? So in ACT, if people are improving and benefiting, the idea is that these six processes are changing, right? That people are developing a better present moment awareness, that they're becoming more diffused, that they're learning to accept things that are difficult, to pursue their values, to see themselves and others in a flexible way, shifting perspective, and to live their life effectively and meaningfully. And together, all of this we call our big overarching process of psychological flexibility. So our model says that when people benefit from ACT, they benefit from improving their psychological flexibility and each of these six processes. So if we want to evaluate this model, right? This mid-level model of psychological flexibility, one thing we can do is think about what it is it's representing, what it is it's meant to do for the clinicians who use it. And like any middle-level terms, the function of the ACT model, the psychological flexibility model, is to represent in an accurate and effective way all of what's beneath it, right? So the idea of those middle-level terms, and by middle level, all we mean is it's not common language, the way you would talk to anybody in a non-professional setting, but it's not quite our basic terms. It's not the terms or findings that come directly out of the lab, right? It's language that's situated between them. And that language has a job, right? The reason that middle level language exists is in order to orient people that might not be doing basic research or that might not be grounded in any particular philosophical perspective or have practiced speaking about philosophy. It should represent those theoretical terms and those philosophical terms in a way that's workable for clinicians, that people that are actually applying ACT in the room are doing so in a way that's consistent with our basic findings and consistent with our philosophical foundations. And of course, it's not just that it's consistent, we want it to be effective, right? And so most therapies are like this. When we go to a training and get taught how it is we should do ACT or DBT or functional analytic psychotherapy or any number of cognitive behavior therapies, we learn from the middle level, right? We learn clinical terms for use in the room. And we could ask ourselves of any of those terms, do they work to make clinicians better at what they do, right? Do they work to teach us in a way that we're sensitive to those basic findings and those theoretical foundations, even if we're not using that language? And so one way that we could ask ourselves in ACT, if that's worked, is if when we start from our theoretical foundations or our philosophical foundations, if we land in this.
Maybe
yes.
Just a little slow. Can be
okay.
Time.
Sure. Yeah. And so let me back up a little bit. And so most trainings start at the middle level, right? Most trainings teach clinicians in those middle level terms. And so we can ask ourselves, are those middle level terms effective at teaching us or at orienting us to basic principles and philosophical foundations in the therapy room? So today we're going to dig into those philosophical foundations and work our way up from the philosophical foundations through the basic principles and finally landing on the implications in the therapy room. And so we'll start with our philosophical foundations, and you might be familiar with the terms functional contextualism. Some of our foundations are based on Pepper's world hypotheses, a guy named Stephen Pepper, who thought it was useful to look amongst different sciences, different voices in science, and identify how at the most basic levels, they differed in what he called worldview, right? The kind of fundamental foundations. And in that world, those differences in worldview is contained one aspect we'll talk about today, and that's how it is that different scientific worldviews see truth, how it is they decide what is true and what is not true. If you're familiar with philosophy, you might recognize this as epistemology. And if you're not, suffice to say that sciences differ in how it is that we see truth. The most common sort of approach to truth is to treat, let me back up. The most common approach to truth is to treat it in terms of correspondence or coherence. how much do our stories about the world hang together? How coherent are they? And how much do they reflect the world? But this is not the worldview that we take in contextual behavioral science or in functional contextualism. Instead, we see the world and everything in it that we're interested in speaking about in terms of its context. We approach everything that we observe in such a way that it can only really be known by us knowing what it is that surrounds it. You can imagine, for example, a vase defined not just by the shape of the vase, but by the empty space within it and the empty space around it. So when we're understanding our client's behavior, when we're understanding an organization's actions, when we're understanding the interplay of a couple or a family, right? We can shrink down to one person's behavior and look at everything else as context, or we can zoom out to the activities of an organization and look at everything else as context. When we're observing ourselves, right, we can only understand our own behavior in the context of everything else around it. In this way, in contextualism, the whole, the everything is thought to be primary, that's the most fundamental is the everything or the whole, and that each piece that we draw out, every variable that we name, right, maybe distinguishing a particular behavior in the whole behavioral stream, or identifying a particular pattern in a dyad interacting. That when we do that, we're actually kind of drawing out of the whole in a way that's a little bit artificial and dependent on the goals of the scientist, drawing out that particular unit, that unit being secondary to the whole, right? And we see truth in a particular way in this perspective, right? The way that we see truth diverges from the dominant perspective in science, the science that most of us are raised with, that emphasizes scientific discovery as sort of taking the cover off or removing the cover and seeing within to some true way that the world really is. In contextualism, we set that idea of a fundamental truth waiting to be discovered, we set that aside. And instead, we focus on how it is that those terms or stories or ideas about the world, that way of picking apart pieces from the whole, we ask ourselves how well that works. So traditionally, the truth criterion for most scientific perspectives, most common scientific perspectives, and even the most common approach to truth outside of science, relies on what we call a correspondence theory of truth. The idea that our words about the world, our terms, our labels, our theories, that what they should be doing is reflecting a true world, that when something is different in the world, we should have two different terms. When a new pattern is discovered, we should have a new term to include that pattern. That the process of science is getting better and better at seeing the world as it is and all its little distinctions and exceptions, and giving each of those new words that match perfectly. You can almost imagine it like an actual mirror, and we know that we can't see the world directly, but we can see the mirror. We can interact with our ideas about the world, and that when we do, that can lead us to do better and better work. So if we were hammering in a nail that we couldn't really see with a hammer that we couldn't really see, we could at least sort of make sure that our mirror was accurate. We could hold it at a particular angle. And over time, we could sort of knock out any warps or bends in it that would help us to see the world more accurately. And this is not the only perspective. And it's not the perspective we take as contextualists. Instead, we note that all of these ideas, all of these bits, all of these variables, all of these pieces are artifacts of the scientist's behavior. And instead of it being our job to match perfectly our terms and our theories and our conceptualizations to a world, a complex world, that we might acknowledge that when we are making ideas, when we are theorizing or conceptualizing or labeling or naming, that we're already working on the world. That in that moment that we begin to label and conceptualize and describe and theorize, that we are actually having an impact. And instead of attending to that mediation, that idea, that job of having our ideas match the world so that we can work, that we can instead ask ourselves in this moment, as I act upon the world, is this the right tool? Instead of treating our terms and our theories and our conceptualizations as mirrors, we can treat them as hammers and ask ourselves, is this hammer doing the job? If I had a hammer I could never see and a nail I could never see, acknowledging, our own imperfections in observation, could I still close my eyes and tell whether or not the hammer was knocking in the nail? Could I tell if I needed to switch hammers or change the way I was holding it? We're assuming yes. We're assuming that every time we conceptualize a client at that level, one little interaction that we had, every time we analyze that, all the way up to when we develop something like the psychological flexibility model, that we are already working on the world and that we can evaluate that work in the moment directly without appealing to those ideas. This is, of course, a foundational perspective in behavior analysis, the emphasis on pragmatism, on workability and successful working as our metric through which we understand what is true. And it's one of the only places in psychology that this perspective is represented. It's a difficult perspective for us to take because, of course, we have long histories, all of us, of it being very important to check words against truth, right? Of using words to imagine things, of using words to structure things that haven't happened yet, of using words to really shape all of our experience. And so we tend to let those words be at the center. And I would suggest that this is part of how we got the psychological flexibility model and one of the criteria that we can use to evaluate it. Because how is it that we might approach this psychological flexibility model in the room if we're treating each of those processes, the story, the whole psychological flexibility story, and how it applies to this client, if we're treating that like a hammer, if we're checking and saying, how am I using this right now? How is it working for the client? How is it working for me? And instead, quite often what we tend to do is take those terms, those processes, and kind of put them inside the client. It's something quite common that we do with mid-level terms. right? Because they smash together context and behavior and the functional relationship between context and behavior into one term. It can be hard to use them in a way that's actionable, that has immediate action implications, right? Instead, we say things like the client is fused, or boy, they're so avoidant, right? And it's not just how we speak. We also tend to treat those processes, that inflexibility, like it's something happening inside the client. And when we do this, we often tend to appeal then at that level of correspondence, that here is some behavior happening. It matches with my idea of fusion. The client must be fused as if that was a thing inside. And then what do I do about it? That kind of the best I can do is have lots of tools that fit my story for helping clients to be defused. If I notice a client's behavior matches my idea of avoidance, then I might reach into my, sort of all of the interventions that I have for an acceptance intervention, right? The best I can do is apply an intervention that in my story matches for creating acceptance. I think that you can see this reflected in our trainings, right? Many of our trainings can approach therapy as if we were putting together IKEA furniture. And I don't know if everyone's familiar with IKEA. IKEA is a lovely Swedish company, and they send, every kind of furniture that you can imagine: kitchen tables, bunk beds, side tables, coffee tables, chairs, in lots of tiny little pieces. Right. So you've got all of your little bolts and all of your little pieces of wood. You've got any wheels you need, any hinges, and everything is laid out perfectly. And IKEA has this big, beautiful manual that comes with it where you can match every little piece to its perfect picture, right? And at every step, you can check. It tells you perfectly, without even words, beautiful pictures, how to put that bolt directly into that washer. It tells you what not to do, right? Don't put this bolt in this other place. Don't use this piece. You should focus on this one now, right? And carefully moves you through. So at every point, you can compare what you're seeing, what you're creating, right? That bed or that table, you can compare that to the manual, to the images in the book. At any point, right, you're not going to get lost, because if you do something wrong, it won't look like it does in the manual. And of course, this is how many of us approach therapy. We might find ourselves trying to account for all of the variables, just like little nuts and bolts and pieces of wood, right? Maybe something about the client's learning history, little bits of how they're acting in the room, things that I know about their diagnosis or suspect about their diagnosis. And we act like we can take all of those variables and line them up perfectly and check against different ideas, like, am I helping this client diffuse? Or check, is this client avoiding right now or not? Right? We can compare that to ideas. And of course, we might tend to compare our behavior to ideas. Like, is this act consistent, what I'm saying right now? Or is this what an experienced therapist would do? Or, am I even helping this person? I call this playing the correspondence game. And any time in therapy that we find ourselves matching what we see in front of us to an idea, we're playing a correspondence game. And I think stepping away from our philosophical foundations as contextualists, we can't really help it, right? It's how we interact with language all the time. But when we catch ourselves doing it, we can do something a little bit different. Instead, I think we can play the function game. So instead of the therapy process being treated like putting together IKEA furniture, I'm going to suggest that it's more like doing pottery. It's more like throwing clay. So, of course, we don't have a big manual, often that's perfectly suited to this client, right? We might have some general ideas about the work that we want to do. There's not fewer variables if we're throwing clay. Lots of things matter. There's lots of little parts you could pick apart. Of course, there's your hands and any tools you have, and the clay and the table that spins. But also, right, if we dig in, just like there's bolts and nuts and screws, right, for the furniture, there's aspects of this clay that really, really matter. Like what the clay is, how the clay is composed, right? What different minerals are included in the clay, how roughly it's broken down, how fine the little bits are within the clay. Also, how much moisture is in the clay really matters. All of these things matter for how I'm going to move my hands, right, to interact with the clay. And it's not just aspects of the clay that matter, right? Unlike putting together IKEA furniture, everything around the clay matters. I live in Louisiana. It's like 99% humidity all the time, right? If I became a wonderful potter here, but then I went to another country or a place that was not 99% humidity, what I needed to do with the clay would change just because of the air around it, right? And not only that, it's not only variables in the clay or in the air around the clay or in the elevation, right? It's also things that are different about me, variables in my behavior. So how tired my fingers are, right, might matter with respect to what I need to do from one moment to the next. Whether or not I've cut my fingernails might matter. My body temperature might matter. How well I slept last night, or what I had for breakfast, or whether or not I had an argument with my child before I dropped them off at high school. Right? All of these things could influence that interaction between my fingers and the clay and what actual moves I need to do to create what it is I'm trying to create from that clay to the end product. And not only that, but if you ask most people who work with clay, they'll note that every piece of clay can't be any piece of finished pottery, right? That when you get the clay, you don't know what it's going to be when it's finished. Some pieces of clay will never be a fine, thin vase, right? Very delicate. And some pieces of clay will never be a thick, round platter, right? That every piece of clay will be finished in a different way. What it means for the potter to be finished interacting with it will be different. And so how does the potter know? Well, they begin interacting with it. They put their hands on it, right? Any manual that included all those variables would be unusable, right? So instead, their temperature in their body is whatever it is, and the humidity is whatever it is, and the composition of the clay is whatever it is. They might not even name it before putting their hands on the clay and beginning to work with it, beginning to feel what it feels like for the clay to move under their hands, getting a speed and a rhythm with how it is that they're moving, and gradually starting to behave the potter starting to behave and move their fingers and watching how it is the clay responds in a moment to moment to moment way. And if you've ever seen someone work who is really expert in act, you might notice this. Notice a quality of them moving with ease, right, around that hexaflex if we're looking from that perspective, but gradually shaping the repertoire over time, that you can see this really intimate connection between their behavior as it's unfolding and the client's behavior as it's unfolding. I call this playing the function game. Instead of comparing the client's behavior to an idea, instead of comparing my behavior to an idea and asking if it corresponds or not, that we have this other choice that's about behaving and watching the client behave and looking for that tension between our behavior and the client's behavior. And then gradually, once we've got that connection, gently moving the repertoire in the directions we want, in the direction towards psychological flexibility. So in any moment that we find ourselves comparing what's happening in front of us to an idea, staying true to our contextual foundations, our philosophical foundations, would mean coming back to the interaction that's happening right now, right? Setting those ideas aside as just things, more things happening now, more behavior happening now, and watching how it is that we can impact the client's behavior towards flexibility. And so this is a distinction, and I just want you to pause for a moment. And all of you who are studying to be therapists, who are therapists now, or who have had a time in your life where you were doing therapy, see if you can't sort of pause and reflect in your own memories, right, in your own experience. See if you can get a sense of function game versus correspondence game for you. You know, what are moments when you find yourself likely to play the correspondence game, to ask yourself and spend time in session comparing to a diagnostic category or to a dimension of the hexaflex, or to the idea of whether or not you're being a good therapist or a good ACT therapist. And go ahead and see if you can recall the opposite. Moments when it might almost feel instinctual, right? Those moments when instead of knowing in order to do, you find yourself doing in order to know, right? Watching that moment to moment interaction with the client. See if you can pause and notice if it's easier with certain clients than others, or when you're resourced in a certain way as opposed to other days. Or maybe even over the trajectory of your career. I've had some people tell me that they do this best when they forget about ACT altogether. So hopefully this doesn't cause you to abandon ACT, but you might pause and reflect. One thing that we could ask ourselves is, what would happen if there was an approach to science or approach to behavioral science that was totally grounded in the function game? And of course, this brings us one step up on our pyramid from our philosophical foundations to our theoretical foundations. As contextual behavioral scientists or as ACT therapists, we are grounded in behavior analysis. And behavior analysis has lots and lots and lots of terms. Right? Lots and lots and lots of theories, lots of stories about the world that for some people are pretty difficult to access. In fact, that's why we have mid-level terms, right? It's because this language is often difficult for people, right? It doesn't translate for most people directly into the work in the therapy room. And I still think it's useful. So I'm going to present to you a particular approach to those theoretical foundations. And we're going to start with the idea that every term in behavior analysis, every term in behaviorism is really referring to one of three things. It's either a context word, right? Something outside of the behavioral stream, a behavior word, or it's a word that describes the relationship between context and behavior, a function word. So any specific, right, any specific behavioral term that you can think of fits into one of those three categories. It's either a behavior word, a context word, or it's a word that describes a relationship between context and behavior. And so we are going to use actually just those three terms to begin with. See if they're not a little bit more workable when it comes to thinking about clinical implications of behaviorism. So the behaviorism that I'm going to offer to you is grounded more in an interbehavioral perspective. And if we think about Pepper's contextualism, the interbehavioral perspective sort of holds central that idea that the world, that everything, the world and everything beyond it can be thought of as the whole, and that everything that we do as scientists, picking out particular terms, is an artifact of our behavior. Right? It's just our behavior in the moment and is to some extent artificial. So we in behavior analysis can in any moment pick out something that we're calling behavior. If there's an organism that we're observing that we can watch and choose out of everything else that's going on who the behaving organism is and what we're going to focus on behaviorally. From this perspective, when we talk about behavior, we're not talking about a single thing an organism does. We think of behavior as embedded in an entire stream, that at any one moment, everything that you do, right, is all part of a continuous stream. Your behavior is changing in a moment to moment to moment way. And all of those things that we could call separate behaviors, like you are breathing and you are thinking and you are sitting, maybe you're listening or writing, all of those different behaviors that you're doing can all be thought of as currents in the stream. Right? So the stream is constantly changing and flowing. And just like currents might intersect and influence each other, all of your behaviors are interacting. If you held your breath suddenly, your thinking could only go on so long, right? So all of those behaviors are working together and interacting together, in part because they're really a whole. It's really just one behavioral stream flowing from you, right? When we pick out a specific behavior, right, we're just abstracting from that whole. We're just peeling one behavior out from the whole, something that we can attend to, right? But we acknowledge that whole dynamic, interactive behavioral stream that's just moving and changing through time. And for us to really understand behavior, remember we take a contextual perspective, we also want to account for context. And so context from this perspective, from the perspective I'm sharing with you, is everything outside of the behavioral stream that influences it, that has a relationship with everything inside the behavioral stream. Right? And I want to point this out, that this is a little bit different from how we sometimes talk about context in contextual behavioral science. You may have heard people, or you may have said even yourself, something like, what does the client do in the context of anxiety? Or how is the client behaving in the context of self-deprecating thoughts? Right? And in this way, treating some of those behaviors as if they're things happening inside the client, setting a context for other behaviors. In this perspective that we're going to take here, we're going to only call context things outside of the behavioral stream. We're still acknowledging that all of those behaviors are interacting, that your thoughts are interacting with your feelings, and your feelings are interacting with your physiology, and your physiology is interacting with your overt behavior, that all of that is interacting. They're all influencing each other. Right? But we're not going to call those context, because we want all things that we call context to be directly actionable, to be directly manipulable from outside of the behavioral stream. That's where we live, outside of the people's behavior that we're trying to influence. Right? So we will kind of draw a line around the behavioral stream and say everything outside of that could be context, right? If we were taking an absolute perspective, we might say everything is context. It all matters, right? But we're going to focus on two aspects. One, that it reliably changes with behavior. So when that aspect of context changes, the aspect of behavior that we're focusing on changes, right? We want it to have a relationship with behavior, and that it's manipulable or actionable directly, that we can move that context, right? So for this reason, from an interbehavioral perspective, we're acknowledging that every aspect of the client's history that in our story might matter, their parenting that they had, or early bullying experiences, or a childhood illness, right? Instead of having that as a story that we have to check against, that we can never really access or observe ourselves, from this perspective, all of that history is right here present in the immediate context. Because when we're interested in context or behavior, we're not just focused on the shape of it. We're not just looking at the context topographically, right? And we're not just looking at behavior topographically or what it looks like from the outside. Instead, we're most interested in context and behavior functionally. We're most interested in how the context influences the behavior and the behavior influences the context. So in this way, any history that matters about the client, right, any aspects of context that have historically mattered, that are going to matter here and now, we can observe directly simply by making that history present. So we're not worried about the past or the future as things that we can't access. Instead, we're interested in the past and the future as things that can be directly observed right now, right? By us making them psychologically present. And not just that, but because we're going to take a more interbehavioral perspective for just a bit today, we're also not wondering about behaviors that we call private. And it's not that we don't think thinking and feeling and remembering are all happening. It's that we are going to assume that we can see them happening, that we can see them unfolding, that their privacy or their subtlety is actually an artifact of my relationship as the observer with those events. That the reason why we call them private behaviors is because of our relationship with them as observers. So if I'm observing you and you're thinking, right, how easily I can read what it is that you're thinking or feeling is going to depend on my history with you in contexts like this, right? And for you, it might be very apparent because you have been with your thoughts in contexts like this 100% of the time. Every time you were thinking, you were there to observe that thinking, right? So for you, your thoughts and feelings are all very clear, right? Crystal clear. You can see them all 100%. So we act as if they're inside the person in a private place tucked away. But I'm going to ask you to think for a moment about people that you know very well. Right. So I have a partner that I live with and children, and I can be having a conversation with my partner and see his eyebrow go in a particular way. And I know that he is thinking, and probably if I'm paying attention to what's going around him, I know what he is thinking. Right. We might not put the exact same words around it. He's a lot more familiar with his thinking in these contexts, right? But I know what he's thinking. And I have my own words that I would put around it most of the time, right? So from this perspective, history is not somewhere else. It's not somewhere that we have to put on our ideas and check to see if we're corresponding with our ideas about their history. And private events are not happening somewhere else. Thoughts and feelings and memories and imagining that's not happening inside the person. It's not something I have to account for and guess at with my ideas and then compare what I can see to those ideas. That it's right there in the moment, in the interaction between context and behavior. And that's what we call function, in fact. That relationship between context and behavior is the function, right? If we say, what is the function of that context? We're saying, what is the behavior that is occurring in that context? If we're saying, what is the function of that behavior? We're saying, what are the conditions under which that behavior occurs? So from this perspective, we can think of function as that bi-directional relationship between context and behavior. And just like behavior is a constant stream unfolding with all of its parts interacting, and just like context around it is unfolding all of its parts of context interacting, so context and behavior and all of their parts are constantly changing in a moment-to-moment way. Here too, it's a little different from how we might talk about function when we're not grounded in a contextual behavioral perspective. You know, if I say, what is the function of that client's behavior? Well, really what I'm asking is, what are they responding to in this moment? What contextual change just happened that is related to that change in behavior? And, you know, for us, of course, we can make all of these things present using our words. We can ask ourselves what the function of a behavior is by changing the context, because in the therapy room, we are the primary context. So if I want to understand a client's behavior, understanding it would just mean making it happen. Remember, we're not knowing to do, we're doing to know. If I'm concerned about the kinds of behaviors that my client engages in when they're anxious, then I can use words to make the context that evoke anxiety present in the here and now. And I can observe their behavior in response to it. And I can begin to change the context, each of my interventions, changing the context slightly to assess how rigid is this behavior? What can they do with it? Can they take a step back? Can they breathe? Can they observe their thinking? Whatever my targets are, we'll talk more about targets. But I can invite those. I can test any questions that I have about behavior. I can use to assess right there in the moment how rigid or flexible the behavior is. And not only that, but I can use those words to make new contexts present that grow the behavioral repertoire in the directions I'm interested in growing it. And this is what I think we mean by clinical behavior analysis, is that just like observing a potter interacting with clay, Just like observing behavior unfolding in a dynamic, changing context, we can observe our behavior changing with the client's behavior, establishing a relationship between their ongoing behavioral stream and our stream as the context for that behavior, watching how we influence their behavior in a moment-to-moment way, playing that function game in a moment-to-moment way, not just as assessment, but as our intervention in and of itself. And this could feel overwhelming because if function is just the relationship between context and behavior, then at any moment, there could be almost an infinite number of functions that we could talk about. Right now, you're engaging in thousands of behaviors, even if you're sitting very still listening, right? It all depends on which behaviors we pick out from which other ones and how far out we zoom to describe the behavior. There's all kinds of aspects of context that are influencing it. So it can be overwhelming to imagine all of the ways we could talk about function, that relationship between context and behavior. But I'm going to introduce one more distinction, right? So all of our behavioral terms, we're going to boil down to context, behavior, function, and I'm going to give you one more discrimination, right? So two more terms, and that's aversive or appetitive. So we can describe the functional relationship between the ongoing behavioral stream and all of that changing context around it, right? That place that they meet and interact. We can call that functional relationship or distinguish that functional relationship in terms of how aversive or appetitive that relationship is. Right. And when we say aversive control versus appetitive control, or aversive relationship, aversive functions versus appetitive functions, right, what we're really talking about is the distinction between some behaviors that are about going towards something and some behaviors that are about going away from something. So some aspects of context are things that we'll work for, and some aspects of context are things that we will work to get away from, right? And we can imagine what happens to the rest of the repertoire and the relationships between context and behavior under aversive control and under appetitive control, because there are more differences than just away or toward. In fact, if you're familiar with the behavioral perspective, you might be familiar with this problem where it can be almost like syntax. If right now I drink from my water, this is a good excuse. If right now I drink from my water, you could say, is she moving towards, feeling satisfied, or is she moving away from thirst? Right, if I put on a jacket, am I moving towards warmth or away from cold? Right? It can start to feel like either could be applicable. Same thing with negative and positive reinforcement. Is it negatively reinforcing or positively reinforcing? Is something being added or taken away? But I'm going to suggest to you that this is something that we can test in the moment, in the room, because aversive and appetitive contexts have other functions at the level of that whole unfolding stream. When we're talking about behavior under aversive control, that running, that fighting, that hiding, even if it doesn't look like running, fighting, or hiding, there's other things that happen to that behavior, to that repertoire, and to that context, in fact. So when we are running, fighting, or hiding, lots of other behaviors drop out. The stream becomes narrow and tight. Functionally speaking, when we are acting under aversive control, the kinds of behaviors we have access to are lots of behaviors under aversive control, right? And at the respondent level, just our perceiving and experiencing and reacting level, that becomes narrow as well. So in fact, as our behavioral stream becomes tighter and more narrow and more rigid, the context also becomes tighter and more narrow and more rigid. You can imagine when you're running, fighting, or hiding, right? You're not attending to the nice breeze or the smell of flowers or, how good it feels in your body today. The world becomes smaller and the repertoire becomes smaller. You might recognize this at the mid-level. We call it psychological inflexibility, right? When that repertoire becomes narrow. And of course, that only compounds on itself aversive learning or learning under aversive control. The more that we come to run, fight, or hide in new places, right, the more that running, fighting, or hiding becomes the way that we learn. We start to make up rules about how to run, fight, or hide more effectively, and gradually our world narrows and becomes increasingly difficult for us to access other kinds of learning, right? Learning under appetitive control. So the better and better we get at aversive learning, the harder it is for us to learn in other ways, right? You might again, kind of translate a little bit, the more psychologically flexible we are in more places, the harder flexibility is. And of course, the opposite is true of behavior under appetitive control. That behavior is about seeking, about exploring, about engaging and enjoying, and it has effects at the level of the whole repertoire. When we are engaging in behavior under appetitive control, also at the respondent level, the world is bigger. More things come into our attention, right? More aspects of the world are present for us. So the behavioral repertoire gets bigger, right? Gets more dynamic, more aspects of the repertoire are available, more behaviors are available. And as that occurs, also more aspects of the environment become available. The context gets bigger, right? More things in the world can serve as context under appetitive control. And the functions expand, right? We have lots of different functions, all appetitive, that can be at play in any one moment. And so this is what we are attempting to do in the therapy room, I think, that we're attempting to transition, right, repertoires that are predominantly under aversive control to repertoires that are predominantly under appetitive control, to shift our clients from inflexibility to flexibility. The implications are that in the therapy room, we create the context for behavior under aversive control. We have our foundational, right? Our foundational relational appetitives. We treat our clients with kindness. We give them our attention, right? In my perspective, we don't remove or withdraw those, right? Instead, we use those as a foundation that allows us to bring in aversives, to use that language to introduce the context that create behavior under aversive control out in our client's world, that we can use those words to bring them into the here and now. Do you recall the sadness that came up for you last Tuesday? Or I wonder what happens if I bring up your mom in this moment. Can you tell me about a time this week that you felt very stressed? Or, I wonder what concerns are showing up right now. That with language, we can make those aversives present. Watch the client begin to run, fight, or hide, right? poke at it a bit, see if we can change context to see, is it behavior under aversive control? And then once we've got the client under aversive control, we can add to that context and gradually expand that context bit by bit to teach new behaviors in the context of the aversives. And if we do that successfully, as we add to the context and then support that behavior change with new appetitives, new instructions and new appetitives, as we're expanding the context, we're expanding the repertoire. Right, to the extent that that new context comes to bear, comes to have a relationship with the behavior we're observing, the context just got bigger. The repertoire just got bigger. We went from tight and narrow to maybe one new behavior. Maybe we asked the client with all of their stress present, feeling anxiety. Maybe we asked them to notice what that anxiety feels like in their body. And that's one new behavior that out in the world in context similar to the one I've created, they're more likely to stop and notice that they what it feels like in their body. And maybe they notice their thoughts now and notice what thoughts are coming to mind. And that's a new behavior they have at hand next time they're in an aversive context. Maybe they shift perspective or take a step back and see themselves through another's eyes, or approach themselves with compassion, or notice a value that's relevant. Anything new that they do in the room is a new behavior that they will have next time they're in contexts that are aversive. And not only will their behavior be bigger, but those contexts will be bigger. There'll be the aversive there, and also any aspect of the context is more likely to influence behavior as we broaden it out. I think this has implications then in that for every client, our first job is going to be to see what behavior under aversive control looks like on them, and to see what behavior under appetitive control looks like on them. We're going to start intervening. We're going to get the clay spinning and start to put our hands on it. We're going to get the client behaving and start intervening to assess what aversive control looks like and what appetitive control looks like. And the behavioral stream is so complex, we won't be able to pay attention to everything the client is doing. So we'll try to pick a few kind of proxy behaviors, a few parts of the aversive response class that really stand out, that we can really see and pay attention to. We'll start to pick out a few pieces of the appetitive response class that we can really pay attention to, that serve as good proxies for the rest of that behavioral stream. So we can watch. We can bring the client under aversive control and add to the context to start to expand out. And we can track when the behavior is under appetitive control. And it'll be different for every client in front of us, just like every piece of clay is different, right? What appetitive control looks like for them, what psychological flexibility looks like for them will be different. And it might even be different for clients on different days or in different sessions. Some days it might be harder for you to pay attention to more subtle things. Some days our clients might be in a space that we haven't seen them before, appealing to behaviors that we haven't ever seen. And so we're back to assessment. Is this under aversive control or under appetitive control? And what can I do to move the client towards appetitive control in this moment and without taking away the aversives? And once we've got assessment going, once we've got a good sense of what aversive and appetitive look like, it's our job to build the repertoire, to choose behaviors that would be good for the client to have in situations that function aversively. And I think this is really where we come together with a psychological flexibility model. Because if we're handling those mid-level terms with an eye on our functional contextual foundations, right, then that's how we're treating those processes. We're not treating them as things inside the client, right? We're treating them as new behaviors that we would like to teach the client. We're treating them as things that we'd like the client to be able to do when they're out in the world in contexts that function aversively. So if we're working from this perspective, using those 6 processes, we're inviting behavior under aversive control. We're watching the client begin to run, fight, or hide. And then we're introducing new contexts that give them a chance to diffuse or accept or commit or shift perspective or whatever the target behaviors are that we're playing with. And so we're going to move into unpacking then that psychological flexibility model in terms of the target behaviors that we would actually try to build in the client's repertoire. So the first that and for each of these, for each of these, I want you to pause and consider what some of the things are that you do in the therapy room already that fit with these behavioral targets. They might be big exercises, sort of traditional ACT exercises, but they also might be tiny little moves that you do, sometimes without even thinking about it, that serve these particular functions. So the first target, kind of chunk of targets that we're going to talk about are perhaps some of our most simple. Shifting, we like our clients to be able to shift their attention amongst different thoughts that they're having, different feelings that they're having, and different perceptual experiences that they're having. Right? So we want clients to be able to shift attention amongst thoughts, amongst feelings, and amongst behaviors. And this is because this is something that drops out under aversive control, that when we're running, fighting, or hiding, the only feelings we're paying attention to are the ones connected to that aversive function. If we have a panic disorder, we might be paying attention to our heartbeat, right? Watching and feeling our pulse. If we're scared of something that we're anticipating is going to be happening, we might be ruminating or perseverating on a fear about the future. But other thoughts, other feelings, right? Other sensations that don't fit with that aversive tend to drop out, you know? So we gradually introduce behavior under aversive control, get the client running, fighting, or hiding, and then we invite them to shift their attention amongst thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. We ask them to notice if any memories are showing up right now, or if they can pause and watch what their mind is doing. We ask them to name an emotion that they're having. If there's any feelings that they can name here. Sometimes if they name 1 or 2, we might push for more. Is there another feeling here that you can notice? We might ask them what's happening in their body, or even invite them to pay attention to things happening around them, right, as a way of centering or grounding. That all of these very simple invitations to notice a thought, a feeling, a perception, that every time the client successfully does that in a context that includes an aversive, they are more likely to engage in that behavior in similar contexts out in the world. If the aversive is present, then the practice we're doing will matter out in the world, right? And notice that these are really cool behaviors because as they engage in them, context is also growing, right? As I'm noticing what I'm thinking in a more broad and flexible way, the things in the world that fit with that thinking are going to be more accessible to me. As I'm noticing what I'm feeling, the things in the world that could matter with respect for what I'm feeling are going to be more present. And same thing with perceptual experiences, that as we expand our repertoire, we're also expanding the context. Now, some of these things that we come to attend to will be aversive themselves. If I ask a client to pay attention to what's happening in their body and they have body image issues, for example, then we might actually be asking them to be in contact with the aversive itself and even to approach that aversive. And this is actually one of the things that we train directly. So we invite behavior under aversive control. We get that client running, fighting, or hiding. We invite them to shift attention amongst thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. And we will hit some things that are aversive. And when we do, we bring awareness to that experience. We invite our clients, can you notice what's happening now? We might say there's something hard here. Is that right? Do you feel that? We might even invite them to approach it or to intensify their experience. And ask them if they can sit with it, if they can lean into it, right? We might ask them what would happen if they let go of all defense and let this sort of rise up within them. We might just say, ouch, that sounds like it really sucks. When we say any of those things, we are attempting to invite the client to bring awareness and approach behaviors to the aversive themselves. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to function that way, but that's what we're trying to do. And notice that when we do that, if they successfully are able to bring awareness and approach to the aversive, that is a new behavior that they can engage in contexts that are aversive. And not only that, but as the repertoire expands in that way, so does the context, right? They might notice things about the aversive itself that they had never noticed before. My mentor, Kelly Wilson, used to use the example of a snake phobia, that most people who are scared of snakes don't really have much experience with snakes at all. They might report that snakes are slimy or that snakes are spiky, when in fact they're smooth and warm, right? So as the client's repertoire expands, of course, we're not just expanding their repertoire with snakes, we're also expanding their repertoire with self-doubt, with anxiety, with meta anxiety, with old traumatic memories. And as we're expanding their repertoire there, they're coming to learn more and more about the context that pull for those experiences. Maybe even more and more about their own anxiety or traumatic memories. And we will not only be increasing their repertoire with respect to aversives, we also want to expand their behavior with respect to appetitives. Some of the things that we're noticing are happening now, thoughts or feelings or perceptions, as we move around in those spaces, some of them will be appetitive. We'll watch the repertoire sort of grow and open up when we're in contact with them. And we want to train our clients to notice this. We might say something shifted here. I feel a lightness coming. Do you recognize that? Or we might say, this feels important as you say it. Does that happen for you? Right? We might say, you look happy. I'm wondering if happiness is present. What's happening for you with that here? Right? And to the extent that they function that way, we're inviting the client then to notice that there's something appetitive present. We're inviting them to approach that appetitive. We might introduce, if a client says, I feel so worthless, we might ask them if there's a memory that they could call up where they felt worthy, or if they could even imagine feeling worthy one day. Notice as we're doing this, we're both assessing how accessible is that appetitive, and can they stay with it? Can they approach it? And what happens to their repertoire when they do? So we want to invite behavior under aversive control, get that client running, fighting, or hiding. We want to help them gradually become more aware of what they're thinking and feeling and experiencing of their world. We want them to notice some of those things that are aversive and have the choice and repertoire to approach those that are aversive. We want them to notice some things that are repetitive and have the repertoire to approach that which is appetitive. And some aspects of these sort of aspects of context, some of them are going to be significant in a different way. Some of them will be significant in that we tend to collapse them or compile them into the self and others. So some of the aspects of context that we will observe and make present will be relevant to particular others, important people in the client's lives, their concepts of those people, or to their clients' ideas of themselves. Right? Sometimes our interactions with clients make a self present. The client may make self-statements, evaluative statements, for example. And when they do, I can tell that the self is present, right? So if the client says, I'm so worthless, well, a self is present, right? I can tell that the self is in the context by them naming their own worthlessness. So my job would then be to see if I can't expand their experiences of themselves, introduce new aspects of context with my instructions to expand out what other reactions they might have to themselves. So if you see yourself right now in that moment that you name as worthless, what are some of the other reactions that you have to yourself? Are you frustrated with that worthless version of you? Do you have any sympathy for her? Is there anything you want to give her? Or if you could give her an instruction right now, what would you tell her to do? All of those are reactions to the self, and every new one that we practice is a new reaction to self that will be present in aversive contexts out in the world. Same thing with others. We might notice that there's particular others that our clients kind of have stories about. My partner is so blank. My mom never blank, right? And it's rigid and it's tight. And when we notice those others are present in the therapy room, I think it's our job to help to expand there, to ask, can you really see your mom in a moment when she was letting you down? Does that feel accessible? And now with that there, what other reactions do you have towards her? What thoughts, what feelings? Do you have any labels that show up, things you would call her? Is there anything you want from her or want her to do? Can we draw gradually out your reactions to her right here in this moment? And to the extent that the aversives that present out in the world are functionally present here, those will be behaviors that you have at your disposal next time you're in aversive context that make your mom present, or you, or your siblings, or your kids, or whatever it happens to be. So we invite the aversives into the room. We get the client running, fighting, or hiding. We get them noticing what is present, thoughts and feelings and sensations and perceptions. We get them approaching things that are aversive and approaching things that are repetitive. We get them interacting with their experiences of the self and others in broader and broader and more flexible ways. And once we've got, a well sort of filled in context, we also have the option then to start shifting perspectives. We've got all these memories present and all these people present and the self present. And once that's present, we can begin shifting perspective to expand the context even further. Instead of just my here and now perspective being all filled in with all of my repertoire present, right? Maybe I can learn to see what's happening now, what's present psychologically now from another's perspective. That would be switching across person. We invite our clients to do this when we say things like, so that memory of that conflict that you had with your boss, what happens if you revisit that memory, but from his perspective, right? Or if your sister could hear you speaking now about how hurt you've been, do you have any thoughts about what she would feel here? Can you hear these words from her ears? What happens for you now, right? We can switch across person. We can switch across situation. If this anxiety that you're feeling with me now, if you and I were at work, how would this anxiety feel different for you if we were there instead, or at a party, or if you were noticing what you're noticing right now, but up on a podium in front of an audience? I wonder how those thoughts would land for you. That we can use those words to shift perspective in these powerful ways. We can shift across time, right? If you were looking at what's happening now from a younger you's eyes, I wonder what that younger version of you might bring to bear on this moment. Or if the you now could return to a younger you, I wonder how you would see what she saw then differently. And of course, often we collapse all of these. So we switch across person, situation, and time. For example, in the example of revisiting the complex memory with the mom and asking to take the mom's perspective. The situation is different from now, the time is different, and the person is different. So we invite people to run, fight, or hide. We get that behavior under aversive control, right? We begin to expand the context, getting folks to attend to their thoughts, to their feelings, to their sensations and perceptions. We approach things that are aversive and things that are repetitive. We begin to notice the self and others in broader and more flexible ways in our reactions to them. And we begin to shift perspectives in ways that layer up new aspects of context that we can then be responsive to. And the behaviors that include all of these, if we bring all of these together, and once clients are successful at all of these, then we can begin tracking context, behavior, and the functional relationships amongst context and behavior. We might start really simple by asking clients to notice just one little behavior that's happening. Can you see what you're doing right now? We might ask them to explain sort of if they have an understanding of what they're doing and why. Can we tap into that function? Right? We might gradually grow to include things that have happened at different parts of the session. Before, when we were talking about your mom, it felt a little different, your reactions, than they feel now. Can you notice that difference? Tell me what's showing up while you notice that difference, right? We can gradually start to compare and expand. And eventually what we're working up to from this perspective is something that a lot of therapies start with, even some approaches to ACT. The client being able to, in any one moment, notice what it is that they are doing, what it is they are responding to, how it is that's working, how the context is influencing their behavior, and expand their own context out intentionally by shifting amongst different aspects of context, shifting amongst different aspects of that repertoire until they find a behavior that works for them in that current situation. The highest, sort of most complex version of this, I sometimes call experiential problem solving. If you've ever sat with a client and asked them to stop and notice a decision, different ideas related to a decision that they have at hand. So if a client is deciding whether or not to quit their job, right, we might ask them in this moment, without actually quitting, can you imagine if you did right now? If we picked up your phone and we sent the email to your boss, telling him all of what you think of him and that you're out the door as of this moment, can you try that on? What thoughts come up? What feelings are rising up inside you as we talk about this? Is there anything happening physically for you? What if you look and see that version of you quitting once and for all? Do you have any reactions to her? Right? And what about your boss's perspective? If you imagine him opening his phone and go, what? Emily quits? What happens then if you take his perspective? And what would a younger version of you say about quitting this job that you worked so hard to get? You can sort of hear, hopefully, in my examples, that in each of those new decisions, those new paths, that we can practice across all of those skills that the client has built and really try on that idea of quitting once and for all, only to, in the very next moment, say, what if you did the opposite? What if today you really committed? You're going to let go of any other possibilities and fully commit to this job that you worked so hard to get. You're going to set aside, leaving, and instead start thinking about how you can do things differently, how you can change, how you can empower yourself to change things at work. What happens when I say that? What feelings come up for you? What does your mind do with that? Is it, what can you imagine? Tell me how it feels in your body. Can you have any reactions to that version of you? Can you imagine who you might tell or what you might do with that? What their reactions would be? And as we stretch out into that across all the skills the client has, they can try on that context right here in the moment, right here in the room. And we might shift to some in-betweens, right? And all of what we're doing there is tracking, right? We're noticing the impact of different contexts on behavior with the client in such a way that they can do it themselves. And
Emily, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Can you try and slow down a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Inés, voy a vos. Thank you, Emily.
And this is what I think we are doing constantly in the therapy room when we're doing clinical behavior analysis, right? We are introducing aversives into the room. We're watching the client begin to run, fight, or hide. And we're then adding to the context without taking away the aversive to build the repertoire piece by piece by piece. I'm going to share with you a document. This is, I call it my flex notes, but you'll recognize on each row, and I'll make sure that the organizers get this document, you'll recognize on each row different aspects of behavior that we want to expand. Up there at the top, the target R to aversive, that's target response. With the aversive present, what can the client do there? How can they demonstrate flexibility in the presence of that aversive? In the middle, I track how much prompting it took. We can vary our prompts from very, very specific. Think of it as a most invasive prompt. So for example, asking a client, do you feel anger right now? Would be very specific. Right now, is it anger that you are feeling? Right? I might, though, as they get more skills, I might just ask them, what feelings are present? Right? And eventually, if they have lots of skills, I might say, pause and check in. What's showing up? Could be a thought, could be a feeling, could be physical, getting less and less specific. And eventually, as my clients are moving towards, termination, really finishing our piece of work, when we're doing things like experiential problem solving, then probably I'm not prompting that at all. You may recall some clients you've seen that will start to tell a story and then they'll pause. I'm noticing myself getting angry as we're talking about this. And you didn't even ask. That's really what we're going for, is that the context themselves, the context that used to function only as aversives, are now evoking all of these behaviors that we've practiced. People will sometimes ask, how can you be sure? How can you foster generalization? How can you make sure that what you practice in the room actually happens out in the world? And what I counter with is, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about not bringing their behavior outside of the room. I'm worried about bringing that context inside of the room. If I want to make sure that the behaviors that the client practices with me are happening out in the world, then it's my job to bring as much of their world into this room as I can. Right? If I'm noticing that there's situations where they're not bringing those behaviors to bear, then I have not brought those situations to bear in the therapy room. It might be a new aversive that we need to practice with. I might notice that when I introduce that, I can see in the room what happened out in the world, can see their behavior become tight and rigid, and then we can start to practice building out their repertoire by moving amongst all of these different target behaviors. Oh, and so I might invite you to pause again and to think over the kinds of interventions that you engage in the therapy room, to see if you can sort of sort some things that you do that fall into those different categories there on the flex notes. Notice that some of them might be big exercises and some of them might be tiny things that you haven't even been thinking of as intervention. I'd also invite you to notice why sometimes in this perspective, we might bias or lean towards those smaller interventions. It's because the more that I'm talking, right, the less that I know what the client's responding to, right? And the harder it is for me to pay attention to how it is that they're responding. Also, same thing for the client. The longer that they go on without me intervening, the further their behavior gets from the last bit of context that I intentionally implemented, right? The longer they're going on without intervention, the harder it is for me to understand their behavior functionally. Because to understand it functionally, remember, function just as the relationship between context and behavior, I have to have some context that I can see and manipulate, right? So we might use more micro interventions in this approach, talking less or even stopping in our own explanation or question when we see the client suddenly responding. Right? Sometimes I'll be delivering a metaphor that I think is a wonderful metaphor, but about 2 sentences in, I can see the client start to react. In my old approach, I might have hurried up and rushed and tried to finish my metaphor before they cut me off because I want to get to my point. In this approach, the implication would be for me to pause. What's happening now? I see you're already reacting. Can you tell me what you're noticing? What are you doing right now? Right? What's happening in your head as I say this? But I want to pause and grab it while I've got that context present, while I can understand that behavior functionally in context. So the last thing that I want to mention before we move to questions is some next steps. One reaction that I'll sometimes get from audiences is people will say, I don't know if I'm doing this at all. What if I'm doing everything wrong? You're doing lots of this. I promise you, right? You might just be returning to the correspondence game over and over and over again, even in the moment that you have that reaction, even right now, if you're having that reaction. Instead, I would say that for this to be most useful for you, treat it as if it has functional implications right now. that if you left this meeting and went directly to a session, you could right away start looking at, how am I influencing the client's behavior in this moment? Is the repertoire broad and flexible and sensitive to intervention, or is it tight and rigid? And notice that either is fine. If it's tight and rigid, the job is to add, okay, good, it's a place that I can work. The job is to add to the context and build out their responding in this new aversive context. If the repertoire is broad and flexible, good. We've got a good foundation. We can start adding some aversives and seeing how broad and flexible it can stay as we add different aversives for the client. That in any moment that we find ourselves playing the correspondence game, we can come back to function and get back on the job, which is just moving amongst aversive and appetitive control in such a way as to expand the repertoire. And now we have time for questions. Oh, I'm seeing all Inez's messages to me to slow down. I apologize, Inez. I did not see that. I did not have the chat where I could see it at the time. What questions are showing up for you? Let me ask it this way. If you were going to go out and apply this model today to your very next client, what questions could I answer right now that would make you more willing to do that? Oh, I see one. So this question says, I've been thinking about children who are overprotected. I think the story or narrative they learn is that of their parents. Is working self as context important in this sense? That's an interesting question, Tanya. Thank you. I think for me, it would be making, so for something like this, it would be creating the context for that overprotective behavior to show up in the room, right? We want to see the running, fighting, or hiding happen. So I want to see the behavior that I'd be calling overprotective to happen right there in the room, right? And then I would start to see what the client can do there. Can they tell me what they are feeling? Can they tell me what they are thinking? Can they tell me when they see themselves in challenging situations, what is their reaction to themselves? Maybe when they see their clients or their own children, what are their reactions to their parents or to their own children? And we would really look for those targets depending on what the client can and can't do. Right. So instead of thinking about in general overprotective clients, instead of thinking in general about them, we would think specifically about making that happen and then probing if flexibility with self and flexible perspective taking might be good targets for this particular client. So it could be, but from this approach, we'd test it. We'd see what happens if when we ask them to respond to themselves or to shift perspective, does the repertoire become quite narrow and rigid? Are they unable to do that without a lot of support and practice? What else? I see one in the chat that would need to be translated for me.
Can you hear me, Emily?
I can hear you now.
Okay, because I never know what channel I am. Let me try and read that question and tell you what it says. Oh. The question is, when a client comes to see you and they say, I already know what I've got, I looked at the internet and I know I have panic attacks, what kind of questions can I start asking so that I can start knowing their repertoire?
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially, I think it can be especially difficult when clients know they know a lot or have a lot of ideas, right, about their problem that they are asking you to contend with. It can be hard to play the function game in those situations. So, for me, I think I'm going to answer in two ways. One is right away, I'm talking to clients about this model. I don't use these words, but right away, I'm telling them about the work that I do and how it's going to feel different for them from other conversations or maybe even other therapies. So I'll tell clients at the very first meeting, but as they're signing the informed consent, I'm telling them that this approach, the work that I do isn't about taking anything away. It's not about getting rid of their anxiety or their traumatic memories or their concerns or fears. That instead, my work is about bringing in all the situations that make them think that way or feel that way or remember that way, to bring it into the room and to practice them doing new things with it. Right. And that they'll know, I even go on and say, you'll know that I'm doing this when I ask you questions, when I'll have the sense that something hard is here. And then I'll ask you questions like, can we pause here? Can you tell me what it is that you're thinking? I'm wondering what emotions are present for you. Are there any memories that are here? Can we take somebody else's perspective? That you'll know that we've found a hard place where we're going to start working when you get questions like that. Now, I'll ask other questions that are just getting information. How long have you been in that relationship? Or, have you talked to your boss about it? Whatever. And you'll know that when I ask questions that are about right now, getting you to do a new thing, we are practicing, right? We're practicing what I call flexibility, and that's really the heart of our therapy work. And then throughout the whole intake, when I am gathering information, I'm saying it there too. So if I ask them what their living situation is, or if they've had any surgeries and I see a little shift, I'm going to ask about their feelings. I'm going to ask about their thoughts. I'm going to start to probe all the way down those flex notes to get some initial ideas of what it is the client can do right away. Right. So they come in and say, I'm having panic attacks. I'm going to ask how long has this been going on? What kind of things do you experience that you call panic? But I might also probe if right now you were to sort of see yourself the last time you had a really bad one, just from the outside, staying here with me, but looking from the outside at the you then. Do you have any reactions to them? To her? What are your feelings towards her? Just start probing. Can they do it? Can they show me their reactions? Can they move amongst different reactions? I might even ask them to track. Earlier when you were talking about panic, you sounded very clear. You sounded very resolved. I'm noticing now it feels very present. It feels a little more unsure. Can you feel that? What are your thoughts, when I kind of bring those two here? What's your mind say about that? Right? Just inviting them to try those different skills. We probably won't lean in and work on any of them in particular if I've got a big intake session to do, a big interview to do, but I'm going to start probing them right away, right from the beginning, really no matter what the client comes in with. And then when we move into session, same thing. I think people get tripped up sometimes imagining when the client's behavior are things that feel very highly contextualized out in the room. They're not panicking necessarily in my office, right? And when we have panic attacks, to the extent that we call it panic disorder, most of the suffering is not during the panic attack. Panic attacks rise and fall and resolve within 10, 15 minutes for the most part. It's all of the fear beforehand. It's all of the narrowing of life beforehand. It's the shame and the sense of a loss of control afterwards, the helplessness, right? So we're creating context for all of that, where all that suffering happens. And if the client happens to panic in the room with us, we're writing that out, helping them to stay in their skin during that experience as well, and to come back to the work when it's done, because those are the situations where most of that suffering occurs.
I think there's another question in the chat and lots of comments for you.
Thank you. So let's see. I see this one. Is there a book or a reference that you recommend? Oh, thank you, Tanya. I had Tanya, my brother. I have a brother that was 3 years younger than me. He's dead now, but he was deaf. So I used sign language from the time that I was very young. I was only 3 years old when he was born, and we discovered that he was deaf when he was about 1 year old, 18 months. So I started learning sign language at this kind of at the same time that I was learning English. So I have lots of, for me, this is always correspondence game. This is always function game, context, behavioral stream. I've got all of my gestures. Thank you. I'm glad it's not too distracting. Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, I wish I knew Spanish Sign Language. I would interpret as I sign or as I spoke. I have some references that I can share. There are books on process-based ACT that come at it from a slightly different perspective. And I haven't read most of those books, so I don't have any specific recommendations there. But maybe when I send the organizers the flex notes, I could also share a couple of articles. There's one that I've written on clinical behavior analysis from an interbehavioral perspective that really extends that pottery metaphor, and a couple of other resources that do the theoretical or philosophical foundations, theoretical foundations, and behavioral, or rather hexaflex terms, that kind of helps with clinical implications of those theoretical and philosophical foundations. So I can share all of those as well. Is it okay, Lucia? I'm offering to send all these things to the organizers, and I'm realizing that I'm giving you a job, you and your
That's
team.
more than okay, no worries.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll share a couple of articles there. Anything else? Yeah, that's really cool that you noticed that you caught that, Tanya. That's funny. All right. Thank y'all so much. So I have, just a couple, I think one, maybe more slide that I thought I might offer. And that's because not only does it have my title again, but down there at the bottom, it has my contact information. And I invite you to contact me if there's anything that I can do to help to support your learning journey. If I'm not the person who can help you, I know a lot of people in the ACBS community and beyond. So I'd be happy to put my thinking cap on and to see if there's other people that might be able to help you more. I'm happy to always share resources and to bring anything I can to your journey as an ACT therapist or a contextual behavioral scientist. I have a lot of love for folks that are, intentionally bringing new things to bear in their work. I was able to spend a lot of time with my mentor, Kelly Wilson, in workshops, watching therapists grow themselves constantly. And before I was even doing therapy myself or finished with my degree myself, and I just remember thinking, do people in other careers spend 4 or 5 days on their weekend, crying about their jobs. Do other people do that? And feeling so inspired by joining a career that felt pretty clear that I was going to be a lifelong student. And so I hope if you see me speak in 5 years and I'm still talking in the exact same way, you give me a little shame on you, because my intention is to be constantly growing and learning, and I'm happy to support that in others as well. Well, if y'all need nothing else from me, I imagine you